Welcome, everybody, from wherever you may be tuning in. We welcome you to this virtual town hall meeting brought to you by Clear Minds, Better Lives. Thanks for tuning in again. We really appreciate you and your willingness to be part of our meeting. And as a disclaimer, this meeting will be recorded and we'll also be streaming it live on Facebook. So yeah, but don't worry about your information. Don't worry about anything being posted on your end, because what we're going to do is turn all audio. If your audio is on, please mute it, and also make sure your camera is turned off. We don't want any interference with the speakers. So please, if you're on, mute your audio and also turn your video off. Yeah, thanks. So we put this event together as a way to continue the conversation and educate ourselves as a community on mental health. We'll be discussing 4 main areas pertaining to mental health, which will be mental health versus mental illness. We'll be talking about the stigma of mental health in the African community. We'll be talking about therapy, and we'll also be talking about parenting in effective ways while incorporating mental health. And yeah, so as we discuss, feel free to comment in the chat if you have any questions or anything you'd like addressed. And what we'll do is we'll sort through them and we'll pick 2 questions per topic just for the sake of time and discuss those. But if your question is not picked, please do not feel bad. We're going to pick the ones that we think are, that everyone seems to be curious about per se, but know that your questions are important and continue to post them on the chat, and yeah, we'll get through them as best as we can. So what we'll do is we'll begin with introducing our team members, and yeah, here we go.
Hi everyone, my name is Shiro Karanja. I am the founder of Clear Minds, Better Lives, and I am from St. Louis.
And I am Sherry. I'm also from St. Louis. I mainly oversee our finances, sort of monitor how we allocate our funds and make sure that we're spending within our budget.
Hi everybody, my name is Deb. I am from Chicago and I'm part of the social media, and I'm also responsible for all the graphics and videos that you see on our Instagram.
Hi everyone, glad to have you here. My name is Bogwa and I'm largely responsible for the creative side of things. So the site and also coming up with ideas around.
Right. And I'm Rachel. I also work along with Deb in the social media realm and marketing and yeah, that sort of thing. And I am from Seattle, Washington.
Okay, so we have a special guest speaker today. Dr. Muthoni is here with us. She is a counselor. She is an administrator at Webster University here in St. Louis, and she's a huge advocate of mental health as well. We're honored to be able to introduce these topics to you guys, to be able to kind of just mesh this an hour and a half or an hour or so more so to be able to discuss these different topics, and we're so honored to have her answer your questions again, highlight and be able to expound on these topics. So before she introduces herself, I am gonna actually talk about the topic that we'll start with, because I'll let her talk more about herself as she goes more into this topic, which is mental health versus mental illness. And mental health versus mental illness is a misconception that most people have. So when we say mental health, what we're actually talking about is our emotional well-being, such as stress or having a bad day. Your emotions are constantly changing and they're not in the same balanced loop. So that's what mental health means. And then there's mental illness, which is something that has to be diagnosed. So such as, bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety, those are things you can actually go to the doctor and get medicine for. So we want all of us to have this understanding that mental health is about our emotions and our well-being and taking care of those emotions, and then recognizing that there's mental illness as well. So Dr. Muthoni, the floor is yours.
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to Clear Minds, Better Lives That's a fantastic name for an organization that seeks to promote mental health and mental health awareness in our community. That it really shows a connection between the mind and the body, and that what's going on in our minds really truly does affect what happens with the body, and in essence that it has an impact on the kinds of lives that we live. So talking first about the idea of mental health and mental illness versus mental wellness, or mental health versus mental illness. These are interesting. A lot of times people use this interchangeably, but they really are not interchangeable. When you think about mental health, it's really health, take out the idea of mental, it's really health in general. When you think about health, whether it's physical, emotional, any type of health, is the well-being of an individual on a particular aspect. So in this case, it's on an element of your mental functioning. So mental health is something that it's really a state of being, and it applies to everybody. So when we speak about mental health, everybody has mental health, good or bad or poor, or it's that it really runs on a continuum. And so you have a general continuum, and then on the other end, then you would have mental illness or a mental disorder, and I'll talk about that shortly. But I think it's really important just for us to have a clear understanding that mental health, when you talk about, like May was a mental health awareness month, for example, nationally, that's just a time to promote our well-being. If you think about financial health, what is financial health? Everybody has financial health, whether it's good or bad, but you cannot avoid, you cannot say that this does not apply to me, because by the very fact that you're alive, that you function in one way or another, then mental health, financial health, physical health, all of those things apply to you. So the question is, how is your mental health? And so if you have good mental health, then you function on a day-to-day basis with few challenges. And if your mental health is poor, then that's when you find that you go into perhaps the realm of mental illness. But I do want to shed light on that a little bit, because it's not something that you do that causes you to have mental illness. And that also speaks to some of the things that we talked about, like stigma and a lot of misunderstanding in our community about mental illness and some of the causes of that is not a personal responsibility, that is not because somebody is, that something's really terribly wrong with a person, that they have a mental illness. So I'll go into that a little bit. But just wanting to shed some light on that. So varies in severity in terms of mental health, that your state of being, your general state of being, and you can compare that to a car. For example, if you have a car, your car can be in whatever shape. Now, if you have a car that's sitting in your driveway that's on rocks because it can't run, then you're probably looking at mental illness. But you also can have a car that's running day to day, going, taking you from home to work and to whatever business you have, but that's functioning, but that could use some work. So again, that car might be, if you think of health, the overall state of that car, it's fine, but it could use a tune-up. So when you come to mental illness, that you have to understand that from a continuum where you have, mental health, mental illness that is, you have challenges here and there, and then you have, you may have, as you go higher up on that continuum, then you will need to start seeking help, or you need to start talking to somebody or finding alternative ways to promote your mental well-being. When we think about mental health, there are a lot of factors that contribute to mental health. That could be diet, physical exercise, the environment in which you live, parenting, and I'll come back to talking about in which ways parenting can contribute to mental health or otherwise, the way that we approach parenting, the way that we approach relationships, all of those things can have an impact on our mental health. So I'll go on and talk a little bit about mental illness. This is something that is very, that is ill understood in our community, in the African community in general, but also in the Black community, that there is fear in our communities to talk about mental illness. And, you know, I just think about my own village, for example. I know there are people here who have heard me talk in the past, and sometimes I use a lot of the same examples because they're true. So I remember in my village, growing up in Kenya, in a small village, that there was a man who he had some seasonal illness, that he would have some psychotic illness, and every so often he would be walking around the village yelling, sort of shouting, and people would be afraid of him. And so for me, that was a very early association with mental illness, and we talked about mental illness as madness, and that's how people generally talk about mental illness in Kenya. And again, we'll come back to talking about how that contributes to stigma, but it goes to show how little we understand, and maybe just some communal perspective or just some communal perspectives about mental illness. There are several that are fairly common. I will talk about just a few of this. Mostly the most common mental illness really is depression or mood disorders. Mood disorders, primarily depression as sort of the core, the main one among the mood disorders, where you have elevated mood, you have depressed mood, or, you know, you've heard a lot about bipolar, for example, where you have elevated or you have manic episodes and really depressive episodes, or sort of going cyclically through those. And so a large number of people in this country suffer from mood disorders. They struggle with a mood disorder of one type or another. It would be foolish for us to think, you know, when you think about the percentage of people that suffer from depression in this country, and somehow we as the immigrant community think we're immune to that, that somehow those statistics do not apply to us. You know, when you hear about, say, these 40% of individuals in the United States, or 30% of people in the United States suffer from depression or struggle with depression at one point or other in their lives. And somehow we think that 30% does not apply to Africans, does not apply to people in the immigrant community. We are fooling ourselves. That is not true. So in as much as it is present in the United States, when you think about, you know, in every room where you have 10 people, 3 of those individuals are struggling. 3 out of 10 of the people in that room are struggling with depression, or struggling with a mood disorder of one type or another, or a mental illness of one type or another. So we are not immune, much as we like to think we are. The fact that you sort of hide our head in the sand and think that, you know, because we're not talking about it, that we're not acknowledging it, that it's not happening amongst our people, that's not true. It doesn't go away just because we don't talk about it. So you have mood disorders that are the most common. You have anxiety disorders as well. That manifests greatly in our community. Many things that lead to heightened anxiety disorders. You have personality disorders. Those are much more complex, and we think of personality disorders as pervasive throughout an individual's life. And usually a personality disorder will not be, we don't diagnose personality disorders in children because they're just that much harder to diagnose and also more difficult to treat. And so that when we think about mental illness, the focus is really more on the other things outside of personality disorders, because those do complicate things somewhat. You have psychotic disorders. That would include, you know, things like schizophrenia, for example, schizoaffective disorder. That would be part of the psychotic disorders. And then a large one that we have to grapple with in our community is substance disorders, substance use disorders, substance abuse, addiction disorders. You might think of them as addiction disorders. Addiction disorders could be addiction to food, addiction to, so you have eating, some sort of food addiction. You might have some sexual addictions, pornography, which also is a major thing in our community, even though we don't want to talk about it because it sounds really bad. And so we don't want to admit that this is something that is real within our own community. A lot of alcohol and drugs in our community as well. And then you have trauma. And trauma is another one that we don't think about. So trauma-related disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, is one that we hear commonly, especially with regard to people that are exposed to really difficult circumstances. You think about PTSD mostly for people who have been in accidents or people who have been in combat, but the truth is that PTSD is something, a stress disorder that we live with that. It doesn't have to be because of combat. It doesn't have to be people who have been exposed to combat or really intense situations. You know, just for example, as a result of COVID-19, there are many people who are going to be dealing with some sort of stress disorder that is a result of COVID-19 and of the quarantine and all of the things that have happened within the last several months. So that's also something that is real within our community. The interesting thing though is that all of this can be connected, that, you know, when you have a mood disorder, and in the kind of environment that we live in our community where we are not people that openly talk about mental illness, then a person that struggles with anxiety, a person that struggles with depression, for example, because the places where they can seek help are limited, then they seek help in other ways. They self-medicate because it's a much easier way to try to address the whatever issues they're dealing with. And so then you end up with an increase in substance use disorders amongst our community. And those substance use disorders, that like the more you try to self-medicate, you know, then it's almost exacerbating your mood disorder. So it's this sort of thing that has it sort of goes round and builds upon each other. And so people just sort of keep going further and further. And we're wondering, why do we have such an increase of suicide amongst our community? It's because of all of those factors where we have created an environment that really does not promote help seeking for mental illness. I'll talk about this when I go to talking about therapy and stigma. But when you think about, you know, if I were driving a car and my car, you know, my car starts and it stops, then I go off and then it starts and then it starts sort of, you know, say maybe I'm on the highway and I'm doing 60. In a 60 zone, you have places where the minimum speed is posted. So you have a place where the minimum speed is 45. And so I'm driving this car and I'm going along. And then I realize that my car, something's up with the gas. And I keep trying to go faster and faster, but it's dropping. I'm not doing 60, I'm not doing 50. And then I go below the 45. That is the minimum speed limit in that particular area. I'm not going to just keep insisting on driving, right? It would be foolish to do that, but we do that with mental health. The fact that my car is telling me something's wrong, you need to pull over and call somebody and check on what's going on with your car, right? You're not going to insist on driving that car. If I have a problem, I really truly would pull over, because if I don't pull over, that's a hazard to not just myself, but to other people as well that are on the road. So pulling over to the side and trying to decide what, you know, what's the next step for me? How do I address this current issue? Is really, really important. So when I think about mental illness and how we think of it in our community, it's very important to acknowledge that that life takes its toll on us, on our mental well-being, on our emotional well-being, on our spiritual well-being. So the fact that a person has a mental illness doesn't mean that there's something terribly wrong with them. It is the result of, you know, it's when you think about wear and tear, even for that car, that, you know, if my car starts to slow down, I'm thinking, maybe I haven't had this car checked in quite a while. I haven't taken this car in for service for quite some time. I have not stopped. I've just been running and not, you know, getting gas or not checking the oil or things of that nature. So in the same way, mental health and mental illness require attention. It's the kind of thing that we can't just sit by and think that somebody that we don't have to attend to. We have to actively engage in taking care of our mental health. And if we have signs of mental illness, to acknowledge those. And as a community, talk much more openly about these things. If I'm having a hard day today, that I can go to my spouse, I can go to my sister and say, I'm really struggling today, right? That's the awareness that mental illness, it lingers. It's something that is around us, and it is, It's not an unusual result of the day-to-day life. You cannot keep driving a car and expect not to have some wear and tear. And in the same way, as you go through life, today things go really well, tomorrow things don't go as you expected, or you come across some challenges that you hadn't necessarily planned for. So because of all of those things, it's not unusual that you're going to have some sort of hardships as a result, things that affect your mental and emotional functioning. And so that is mental illness. That's what that is. And so just sort of being aware so that when that happens, you're not taken by surprise. But in fact, perhaps even more importantly, is to think of it as what steps can I take over, what steps can I take in advance to prepare to sort of almost fortress myself, to strengthen myself and protect against a breakdown. Shiro, I see you. Thank you so much. One of the things, in thinking about mental illness, we think about things that make you susceptible to mental illness, or so you can think of things that are a risk factor. Risk factors for mental illness. And then you also have protective factors. So some of those risk factors, those are the things that make you more likely to be susceptible. So, when you think about diet, for example, a poor diet, having poor eating habits, lack of exercise, for example, a lack of structure in your life, all of those are factors that can make you more susceptible to mental illness. Parenting, and that's a big one that we're going to talk about. Parenting is huge. It's a major factor that can be either a protective factor or a risk factor. The way that we work with our children, the way that we raise our kids, the environment that we create in our homes, that can be a factor that either protects our children against a higher likelihood of mental illness, or that makes it more likely that they will fall. So example, when you think about substance use, if you grow up in an environment where substance use is prevalent, that in itself is a risk factor. If you grow up in an environment where violence and physical abuse is prevalent, that is a risk factor that you yourself will be either a perpetrator or a victim of the same, that you're going to be a user that goes over beyond just using, but that you go on to abuse substances as well. So we have to be mindful as individuals, what kind of environment we're creating in our homes, how we're raising our children, and even ourselves as individuals, what am I doing? What are your eating habits? What are your sleeping habits? What are your physical and exercise habits as well, that all help to promote mental health or make you more susceptible to mental illness. So sure, is this a good time for me to stop and take questions?
Yeah, I think we're at the 7:30 mark. So we're gonna start with our first question. What are some of the red flags that show my mental health is deteriorating?
What are some of the red flags that show the deterioration of mental health? Okay. Red flags, those are not the same for everybody. So we have to, first of all, be aware, we have to know ourselves. We have to know the people that we live with. You have to know your children, know your parents. And I say this, actually, one of the things that I really want to make sure that I mention here. Oftentimes we talk about parents and how we are responsible for, when you think about parents and raising our kids. And so as the parent, my immediate response here is to say, as parents, you need to know your children so that you can see any changes that may be taking place. But I also want to say the same for children, especially when you have adult children. If you have that you also know your parents, because it's not only children and young adults that are struggling with mental illness. It's also parents who are struggling with mental illness and not feeling like they have anywhere to go or anybody to talk to. So just sort of a reminder to adult children, be mindful not just of your own self, but also of the other adults in your home, especially parents who have to somehow keep it together and seem like they've really got this when it may not be. So red flags. I think the red flags, you know red flags when you know the person. So we have to be better in community, in relationship with each other. I think of ourselves as if my sister's keeper or my brother's keeper, I cannot know that there's a difference in your behavior, Shiro, if I don't know you, if I have not been attentive to who you are, right? So that then I can start to see signs of change. So that those are the things that we're talking about as red flags. Some clear red flags would be, sometimes people will call for help, will ask for help and say, I'm struggling, I'm really struggling. But many times in our community, people don't come right out and say that, right? So we have to be better at detecting those changes. Some obvious ones are people sort of losing interest in life and becoming somewhat disengaged and isolating themselves. So if you go 4 or 5 days without having seen someone or heard from somebody that you hear from typically, then you should be asking, I wonder what's going on with them. And beyond asking, actually pick up the phone and reach out to them. If you can visit them post-COVID, go see them. My fear in the last few months has been that, this isolation that in the past would have been a red flag now became a way of life because of having to quarantine. And so people could easily fall through the cracks where you don't always know, you can't always tell that this person is isolating. Just because of the nature of social distancing, so that it's easy to confuse isolation and a sense of isolation with the social distancing parameters that have been put in place. Isolation is huge, where a person doesn't necessarily interact with people that much more, and they seem disengaged. They have lost interest in things that were of interest to them previously. Sleeping too much or too little. So you can have manic depressive episodes, or manic episodes, or like, what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think of the word. So a manic episode usually will lead people to not sleep and to just sort of be going and going for a long time. And then you crash and burn almost after a certain point of time. So overactivity, someone that's just sort of going almost as if they are on an energizer battery, and then they crash. And then you see a person that you live with that just sort of has these cycles where they're high energy, then they just sort of crash and burn, high energy. Those are some of the things you look for in bipolar, because in bipolar disorder, you do have some high energy, and that you have to, again, know the person to know that this is out of character for them. Too much, sleeping too much, sleeping too little, eating too much or eating too little. These, emotional eating, or just not eating at all, where you have lost your appetite. So that also could be a red flag. Loss of interest in I guess just, I really have to say the things that you've done in the past. You could also see a drastic weight loss or drastic weight gain. That might be an indication. Substance use is major. A person that is constantly using substances, that's a red flag as well. So if you have someone that you're concerned about, that's the one thing that we have to do better is say something, see something, say something. Don't just presume. And then we also, I think, have to be better at, if someone asks me, am I okay? That it's not that they're putting their nose where they shouldn't. They're not getting up in my business, but they're asking that because they care, and they see something that concerns them, and that I would be grateful that they actually take the time to inquire, are you all right? Right? Those are some of the red flags that you might see, and if you see them, don't be quiet about it. Don't be afraid. It's better to ask something and offend by asking than not to ask. The other thing I'll say here really quickly, I know there might be another question. If you've had somebody attempt suicide or say things that had to do with suicide that indicated some suicidal ideation, many times you'll hear people say, oh, they're just seeking attention. No one is doing that to seek attention. There's so many other ways to get attention, seriously. Attempting suicide is not one of them. It is, and if somebody is attempting suicide to seek attention, then they really need the attention. They really need the attention. So do not dismiss a suicide attempt as an attempt to seek help, or as an attention-seeking gimmick of some sort. Absolutely not. It means that somebody is hurting, that they're in pain, and they're trying to speak to you and say, I need help. So find them the help they need. Sit down and talk with them. You don't have to have the answers, but help them find the answers, the help that they need. But it's never an attention-seeking thing. It's better, again, if it was attention-seeking, give them the attention. Seriously, like what that's the worst that can happen, that then you give them attention and you feel that it wasn't warranted. But don't ever dismiss that as an attention-seeking thing and then not attend to it.
All right. We have time for one more question, and then we'll move into the next topic. How can siblings of those who have attempted suicide or even succeeded navigate life thereafter without becoming depressed? Suicidal themselves.
So siblings of an individual.
Sorry, did you hear my question?
Yeah, could you, sure, you kind of, is that Sherry, right?
Yeah, sorry, let me read the question again. How can siblings of those who have attempted suicide or even succeeded navigate life thereafter without becoming depressed, suicidal themselves?
Okay. How can siblings of those who have attempted suicide or completed suicide navigate life without becoming depressed themselves or attempting suicide or completing suicide themselves, right? Mm-hmm. That's a really good question and a loaded question. So siblings, an individual, so siblings, family members, friends of a person that has committed suicide, that has completed suicide. We try to not use the word committed because it has some, some negative implications, connotations. So a person that has completed suicide, that's a difficult thing, because when you have a sibling or a close friend or a family member complete suicide, there are a lot of feelings that you might go through, or even attempted suicide. There are many questions you might ask yourself. What did I miss? How could I have missed X, Y, Z? And sometimes you might also be angry. Why did they not talk to me? Why did they not trust me enough to tell me that they were hurting and struggling? And so you might start to blame yourself. So you go through a whole range of emotions of trying to process that. And in addition to that, you're hurting yourself. So that can cause you to spiral as well. So when we think about responses, so this is, first of all, you're grieving. Allow yourself to feel the pain. That grief is a natural response to loss, to something as traumatic as that. So when you lose a loved one, that it's natural that you're grieving.
There were still like 3 people lined up.
I think someone else has themselves unmuted. Mute yourself, please. Thank you.
Right. We're good now. So some of that is, so having those feelings, thinking about that is some of that is a part of the grieving process. To be aware that when you feel that way, when you're angry, when you're sad, it's part of a natural process of grieving your loved one, the loss of your loved one. You might also be experiencing your own sense of, or your own feelings of depression. That could be in response to the loss, or it could be just something that you've also struggled with. As we know that there also can be sometimes some genetic predisposition. So if you have a family member that struggles with depression, it's not unusual that you'd have another family member struggle with depression. So the family should rally around these individuals to find them support and help. But also, I think in another, it may have been in a different presentation that I talked, if you heard me talk about this, forgive me for repeating what you already know. But we talk about the stages of grief. Stages of grief are, there are different models of understanding grief. One common one, sort of the most prevalent, the acronym is DABDA. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came up with stages of grief. That is, D is denial, A is anger, the B is for bargaining, D is for depression, and the last one is A for acceptance or sort of resignation. So you can go through all of those, and knowing those, and we can talk about this on another day because I would love to talk about it. I think there's been a lot of loss in our community. That going through those stages is fine, and it's important that you understand what those stages are, that you'll experience all of those emotions, and it's not a bad thing. That's natural. But the last piece, especially for siblings and family members, is one that was not part of the original model. That was 5. There's a last piece that has been added by somebody called David Kessler that worked very much with the original person that proposed this model. And it talks about making meaning, or meaning making. That the death of your loved one, whether it was by suicide or some other way, that you make that mean something, that their death shall not be in vain. And so that's where you start to see people set up this or that or the other. For example, you'd have an organization like this where you have someone that has struggled with depression, but what do you decide to do with that? You make something of it, you give it meaning, and decide that you're going to use this as a vessel to reach out and to help other people. So that's what I would say for those individuals who are struggling. Be gentle with yourself, allow yourself the time to go through all of these stages of grief, but don't do it alone. Seek help, talk to people, and we'll talk as we go on about therapy and stigma. But also, if there are ways to make meaning so that death means something, it's really important to find those ways so that the death of that person is not the final thing about them that you remember, that you take it and mean something and work to make that something that has a positive impact in your life and the lives of others. I'm talking too much, so I'll go on to the next thing.